So today's exercise is going to be to take the retro Amazon backend and update it to work with our Mongo database. And so we mocked this up a lot yesterday during the initial lecture, and we're going to be able to take some of that code and port it over. But if we remember this retro Amazon backend, going back to this was just dealing with an array. And we're going to refactor it to work with the database instead, therefore the data persists. And we'll go ahead and add like user registration, maybe user login, these kinds of additional features. And we're just going to build this out some, taking what we learned yesterday. So go ahead and open up the retro Amazon backend in VS Code where you left it off. And we have a bunch of routes for books and a bunch of logic here that we'll be kind of refactoring. Going back to package.json, we have a few more things brought in here. Remember, we had a .env file. The .env said what port we're on. And we also had a debug channel, right? Instead of console logging things, we had a debug, which can help us in troubleshooting. So there's a debug package that we brought in. We had a start script. And so to boot this up using nodemon, and we tell nodemon to use the .env file, and then nodemon runs a file called server.js. So to kind of boot this up, we're going to say npm run. That's going to run one of our scripts. The name of our script is called start dev. And we kind of get this debug saying server listening. And that's where we're going to start. So now that we've kind of refactored this, well, the first thing I want to do is comment out our array of books because we're not using this anymore. So I'm going to highlight them all. I'm going to hold down Control and press /. And if we want to comment them out, certainly we can, although what the heck, we're not using this, so let's just delete it. Of course, that's going to break a lot of things. So, you know, like it's going to break everything, because that's all this was doing. So maybe we just start refactoring this one at a time. Interestingly enough, this doesn't light up with errors, but I think maybe eventually it will. Certainly it doesn't work. Okay, now we're getting something. So what did we do yesterday? To kind of walk through the steps again, you know, my recommendation to get this up and running is to go to the Atlas website, mongodb.com. You know, if I'm going to connect to my Mongo Atlas, and the easiest way I recommended was to kind of follow this tutorial. And so they give a really, frankly, copy and paste tutorial on how to connect to your Atlas cluster. And I'm just reminding you here, we're not going to do this because we refactored this, right? But if you clicked on connect, we clicked on drivers, and the question was, why did we click on drivers versus clicking on MongoDB for VS Code? When you click on drivers, this is basically how you install MongoDB as a dependency. It's called the MongoDB driver. It's a dependency, it's an NPM package. So when you clicked on this MongoDB driver, we learned how to connect to a Mongo Atlas cluster via Node, right? We're connecting using Node versus the other option was connecting directly through VS Code. Well, we want to connect through Node and NPM because ultimately that's our application connecting. That's our software that's connecting into our Mongo Atlas cluster versus, well, having VS Code connect to your Atlas cluster, because at the end of the day, we're going to take our application and we're going to push it to a server, and then it still needs to connect, right? VS Code doesn't get pushed to the server. Our application gets pushed to the server. So I thought that was a good question that kind of answers the, why are we selecting drivers here? And it's like, well, we're making our application connect. Okay, and then if you're looking here, it's like, well, get started using the node driver, and there's installation instructions, which is not what we need, but we need to kind of get started. So I said, hey, go ahead and click on getting started, and then you just got to kind of like stumble through the docs, and it's like, oh, connect to MongoDB and connection guide, and ultimately you end up here. And here is where we copied the JavaScript to ping our database connection, right? Literally, we copied this, and then we pasted it inside of our server.js, and then we replaced the connection string with our connection string, and then we replaced our password, and then we were pinging, right? Those were the steps that we took yesterday to bare bones it. Now, after that, I kind of said, well, the problem with this code was that it kind of allowed potentially for a bunch of connections. Like every time a client connects, you don't want to create a new connection to a database. If you view a server, as a computer, there are limits to inbound connections. How many inbound connections can you have? And so you kind of want to limit the inbound connections because, again, there are limits. And so what we did once we were pinging is we refactored this code using what's called a singleton pattern. And a singleton pattern ensures that you only have basically one active connection, and it's not going to instantiate a bunch of open connections because, again, those are limiting factors. And so I can kind of show you the refactored code a little bit here. If we look at what we did yesterday and we open up this database module that we created, that's not what we did yesterday. What we did yesterday is on my other screen. If I pull this over, we refactored this a little bit, and we made this _DB. And _DB only instantiates if it's null, right? So if this is falsy, then we go ahead and connect, right? So if this is null, then we connect. Otherwise, if _DB is initialized already, we already have an open connection. We don't need to open another connection, right? The name singleton pattern means it's a single open variable, like a single instance of the variable. Okay, you're not going to have multiple instances of the variable, therefore multiple open connections. You only have a single instance of this _DB variable created. So we refactored this to a singleton pattern, and we said, hey, here's our connect, and then we wrote a separate function called ping, and then you're going to notice here this database module, it calls our ping function. Okay, now ping, if we look in ping calls connect, and connect is where we have our connection string information. The reason I point that out is when we do an npm run start dev, you're going to see a ping. You're going to see ping is successful. It's because this is our function call right here that is running when we start our dev environment. Now, start dev runs index, but it's safe to say that this function call is being called, and I can demonstrate that if I. We'll do it again today. So point is, if you're wondering why when you boot your server we do a ping, I just want to point out there's the method call right there. Okay, so I do recommend kind of having this pulled over And that's what we did yesterday, and that's kind of where we're gonna start a little bit today. Let's go ahead and make our database file. So in our retro Amazon backend, let's go ahead and make a database.js and make sure it's in the root, right? Don't accidentally like put it in routes or anything like that. Just put it in the root folder, right? Make sure it's in the right folder. And to be honest with you, I think we're going to be okay to just copy and paste from what we did yesterday. So if I copy my source code from yesterday and I paste it right on over, like we can just reuse this code. Okay, now ultimately, we're not calling this ping. Normally I would expect to see the ping. It's not calling the ping.
You have to import it.
Yeah, we probably let's do that. That's a good observation. Yesterday we imported everything. We use object destructuring. We said import, like for example, the connect method from database.js. And it's not finding my file. Okay, why is this crashing? We never installed the Mongo driver. Notice it cannot find package. Pretty clear error message here. We need to install that package. So let's take a minute and do that. And again, the command for that is pretty simple. It's npm install MongoDB, or the npm I short for install MongoDB. You can copy it and paste it, or you can just type npm I MongoDB. Okay, so now, yesterday, our import command looked like this. Now, what did this allow us to do? This allowed us to call the connect as a method, just as simple as this, right? When you import using destructuring, you can directly call the method. The other option is to do an import star as, and we could call it DB module from database. When you use this syntax, this brings in an object with a bunch of methods, and so we can just say db module.connect. Okay, so I don't know the right answer here. It's going to be a little bit of preference how you want to bring these things in. The code is longer here. Instead of just directly calling connect, you have to say db module connect, right? But it's more condensed up here on the import statement. Right, you could just say bring it all in. Okay, I don't have a strong preference. Whatever you want to do is fine. I suppose for now, I'll keep doing the individuals for now. And let's do an npm run start dev. I just want to see if it pings without doing an import. Okay, now that it does, so that's kind of interesting that there is a method call, even though our script doesn't say directly to run database.js, because we're importing something here. That method, that ping method, is ultimately being called. I'm also going to notice here, this is a debug channel. And this is a console log. Well, let's refactor that to be a debug channel. So remember to bring in debug, there's a couple of lines here. And these are the debug channels, right, called app server. So we have to import debug from debug, and then we need to create the channel. And we'll call it debug database. So let's go to the top here of our database.js, import debug from debug, and create the channel. So now we have a channel called debug database. Which you could just describe a debug channel as a fancy console log, right? It's got color coded, it's got names, right? It could tell you like this is coming from the server.js file, where this is coming from the database.js file. So it helps you find out where your console logs are coming from. So of course you could probably assume if we go down to here to console log on our ping, we're just going to update that function call to a debug database. And now we get app database pinged your deployment. You successfully connected to MongoDB. Right? And that's fine. I guess you could come up here and say app database capital D. Okay, that's funny how that changed colors. Lowercase d didn't want to do that, but capital D did. That's what I'm used to seeing, the different files having different colors. So I like that. That's going to be my preference.
It may be because of your value, like when you, like with sorting through database, it's numbered. If you look for like alphabetical order, the value of a lowercase is a different value of an uppercase.
Yeah.
It could be the same thing here.
Sure.
Where if we had another one that was a lowercase, then we'd get a yellow lowercase.
So this is cool. We've got our database module, and we've got a debug now in it, and we're now pinging our database, and that was pretty easy to bring over. Well, I don't know that we need to bring in connect over here, but let's go back to book. So now we have a book.js, and let's have our list route now lists from our database. So let's import, what is it called? We got get books, import get books. Now it's database.js, and we do need to go up a couple directories, right? So remember, books.js is inside of a folder called API, inside of a folder called routes. So remember to have relative file pathing. .. / means go up a directory. When you have it twice, it means go up two directories and locate your database.js file. And let's also bring in connect, because we're going to need to connect first. And then let's go ahead and call connect. Const db equals await connect. Because it's an await method, we need to mark this anonymous function right here to be asynchronous. And we're going to say const books equals await get books, and then we're going to send that back. Now I'm going to wrap this in a try catch. Let's see here. Try this. Let's get my tabs correct. Try catch error. And res status. And send back the call stack, you know, a little error message via JSON. So we're going to connect, we're going to read the books from the database, and we're going to send back the books from the database. And now I should be able to boot up Postman, and using my, I don't know if I'm going to have to refactor this, but my Postman. So we're booted up on 3003. So localhost 3003 API books lists. I think that is the correct route. Let's look. So API/books /list looks to be the right route. Let's see if I hit it. Okay, we are getting the data from our database. And I think ultimately I deleted the book that I put in yesterday. But voila, we took the code that we implemented yesterday, we made a few couple changes, and we should now be getting our books. Now, one thing that we didn't do yesterday, and James, I'm coming your way. One thing we didn't do yesterday is we didn't handle server exceptions, right? So if you had an error yesterday, we call it an error. That exception, if you don't basically have try catches being caught properly, it will crash your software and cause a server 500 error, essentially crashing the software. And now we're handling these properly. To handle an exception properly requires 2 steps. Step number 1 is a try catch around your code that makes database calls. So because a database, there's all sorts of errors that can happen in a database, you want to wrap that in a try catch. And you need to have this kind of, again, call it boilerplate exception handling to make sure it doesn't crash. And so we didn't do that yesterday, but we did do this before, so I just want to point that out. Yeah, James.
In that getting all books, does it matter if you have the successful read status inside the try catch, like inside the try part of the try catch?
Good question. So one thing to keep in mind is that this res status, this is sending a response. That's what RES stands for, response, back to the client. And what you have to watch out for is that you can only send one response. It's kind of like in if else. If it's good, you send this response, else it's bad, you send that response. What you have to be wary of, if you want to go out here and maybe you send the status here, now it gets funky and you're going to start seeing error messages potentially because there's a potential that a response is sent here and then it's trying again to send it here, right? So you have to code this in such a way that that your server's only sending one response. And the error message that you would get says something about you can only, you can't send headers twice, some sort of weird error message about sending headers twice. So that's why I put it in here. It's basically, in the good condition, you send this response. In the bad condition, you send that response, right? So every path sends a response, and you're only sending one response. Does that answer your question? Cool. Yep.
I'm sorry, I'm getting an error.
Yeah, no problem.
Can't find the module.
Want to point something out. I just want everyone to double check that we have a debug channel in this book, and just like before, I'm going to capitalize this letter B. Okay, so just one thing, notice when we call this debug book, this is replacing a console log, and if I list my books, here's my console log. It says getting all books, and so we're getting this color coding. If it's coming from the server.js file, we've got this pinkish color. If it's coming from the database file, it's got the yellow color. And if it's coming from a book channel or the book file, we've got this blue color, right? So versus if these were all console logs, they would all just be white. And so you're going to be very familiar in this class, with debugging using this debug channel. And again, it just kind of helps you identify where the code is being called. We use this a lot, right? So again, the way that that's done is with these 2 lines of code, import debug from debug, and then you create a channel. Here's our book channel. Here's our database channel called debug database. And here's our main file called server, debug app server. Okay, so just pointing that out, that we have these different channels. Yes?
Are you able to change the color? Like mine's yellow compared to yours is blue or whatever.
If you go back, back when we started doing debug, I posted something with the color coding, in general.
Yeah.
There's not many options with it, but you can do some of it.
Okay.
So it sounds like the answer is yes. I've never messed with the actual colors, but it sounds like the answer is yes.
Here, I'm gonna repost it real quick.
His is all colorful.
All right, let's refactor getting the book by ID. Okay, so the route is here. Router.get /:ID. Request response. I'm telling you, this is going to be asynchronous method. So let's add the keyword async. Yes, we're going to need to read the ID from the params, but our logic here is going to change. So I'm just going to probably delete that. And let's bring in the method on our import. Another very common thing is people leaving off the .js. I do it all the time myself. So for these imports to work to local resources, meaning files that we wrote, you have to have the .js. Whereas when we're importing from a debug package that someone else wrote, you notice you leave the .js off. So if you wrote the source code, you include the .js, otherwise you don't. What's our method? Is it get book by ID? That doesn't crash, so let's just look at the name that we wrote, get book by ID. That looks right. So we're going to bring in get book by ID. And let's go ahead and say const book await get book by ID. Let's wrap this in a try catch. And if it works, we're going to set res status 200 dot, send back some JSON and send the book back. And let me just verify that our method does return a book. It does return a book using a find one method, converting the string ID into an object ID. That's what we did yesterday. And so now the full path, well, let's just pause and let everyone catch up. All right, let's test our new route. Again, we read the parameter data coming from the client. We send that over to our method, getting the book by ID. That should send back a book. If it does send back a book, we respond with that book to the client. And it looks like API books, if I go to list all books, let's just pull up to kill a mockingbird. And let's send that ID over, and let's get that data back from the server to the client. Thumbs up if it's working, thumbs down if it's not. Couple thumbs up, couple thumbs down. I'll point something out here. This is a variable identifier. You get to call this, we're calling it ID, you could call it identifier, you could call it pizza, cheese, crust, whatever. It doesn't matter. Like any other variable, you get to give it an identifier. Okay? This rec.params.id, guess what? Those have to match. Whatever you call it here, you have to then call it here. This variable and this variable match, okay? So just pointing that out. Then we're creating a new variable here called ID, and then we're passing that to our function. Our function is converting that string into an object ID, hitting the database, getting the data back from the database, sending it to our route, sending it to the client. Data is flying all over the place. It's going from here to there to there to there. That is programming, tracing the variable through the function calls. That's what we're doing. Next method, updating a book. Okay, so I do want to keep this here, but we're changing our logic for updating a book. I'm going to delete all this big old if-else and even the res JSON. Let's bring in our function called get book. Let's see, what do we call it? Update book. Yeah, let's bring in update book. And let's remind ourselves, update book takes an ID and an updated book. So the ID we're going to get from the params. So let's go back to our update route. Hopping all around, I'm sorry. Okay, so here's our update book. We get the ID from params. We're going to get the const updated book from the rec.body. That is correct. Rec.body is an object. We're going to store that object in a variable called updated book. Now, this sends back a database result, and we send that result here. Remember that our result, I'm going to throw that back in a console table. I'm going to show you what this looks like because it had some properties. This variable here, update1, is going to send back an object with some properties. I'm going to show those properties. So then we can code against it over here inside of book. Okay, so I'm going to say const update result equals. Now this is an async method, so add this to be async, and we're going to await update book, sending in the two things. And I'm not going to do any error handling at first. I'm just going to say, I could just say book updated. I'm going to put a little bit of error handling in here once I look at that object. I'm just going to assume it's all going to work, even though that might be a bad assumption. And we're sending a little JSON back saying the book is updated. Again, not doing any error handling, so that's going to have to be updated. All right, let's give this a whirl. And again, I'm not done with it. So let's pull up To Kill a Mockingbird. Here's our ID for that. And let's go to update book. This should be a put. Let's double check that it's a put. And here it is a put. So then back in Postman, let's get our To Kill a Mockingbird. And let's update the price. Price to 13. So I'm going to go to body, and I'm going to change the price to 13. And okay, can I find, okay, so I know yesterday we didn't have this route. So it's now it's API/books. I kind of like the /update. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to add a /update/ID. Right? So I just concatenated that /update to my URI. Okay, now it says book updated. Again, I don't have any way to really test it besides looking. But there it is, a price. Now it's a price string 13, so that's not cool. You might parse float that, but it did in fact update To Kill a Mockingbird, and that is cool. So I also want to look at the modified count, right? So here, this object has a modified count. So this is coming back from the database, right? It's being stored in result, and we're sending result back. And so here, update result, I could do something like this. If update result modified count is 1, then we say the book is updated. Else, we could send a 400 error saying, hey, it's probably on you. You didn't give me a good ID or good data or something like that. Book not updated. Which is kind of interesting. We went from try catches now to a big if else, and I don't like that, to be honest. So I want to catch database errors. And to try catch. I mean, we could still just wrap this big if else in a try block. I don't know that would ultimately be what I like, but and then I guess changing it to a, go back here. Updated book is coming from rec.body. So we could write a little logic here. So we could say if updated book dot price, if there's a price is truthy, then let's do that. Let's update the price to be a float. And so now, kind of going back here and updating price again 13, we do get book updated. And here now we got a decimal 13 instead of a string 13. Yes? No problem. And now that I've got this, I could take the console table out of my database logic. Now that I just wanted to inspect that object. And yeah, I will leave the code here for you to take a look at and troubleshoot. Alrighty, what's next? So let's kind of collapse the update. Let's collapse get book by ID. Let's collapse our list. Okay, new book. So let's see, if I go back to my route here, API books add is my route. API books add is still my route. We're going to read the new book from the we can kind of delete the old logic here. And let's bring in the, I believe we called it add book. Bring in add book up from our database module. And very similar, add book does not like return a book. This query insert one doesn't return a book, it returns information about the operation. And so let's go ahead and console table that just to look at that again. And then we return the result. And so let's const db result equals await. We need to make this async. So make this function async so that we can await this function call. And then let's just do, now we can check that against the inserted count. Thank you for Copilot to recognize the property for me. The inserted count, if the inserted count is 1, let's just send a res.status 200 book title added. I'm cool with that. Else not added. Wrap it all in a try catch. If it throws any exceptions, we want to handle those exceptions. And might be missing a curly. There we go. Let me get this indented properly so you can read it. I guess while we're at it, add a new book to the Mongo Atlas database. All right, test it out, and I'll come back here. So let's go to add book, and we're going to go to the body and kind of add the same book that we did yesterday. Good, not added. So let's see what happened. Let's do a little troubleshooting. Okay, so this actually acknowledged was true, so I think this is probably a problem with my if-else, because I think if I go to my list all books, even though it says not added, it was added. Okay, so that's actually a problem with my if-else. The property I should have checked against, as you can see here, is acknowledged. So it's not if db result inserted count, it's dot acknowledged is true. So yeah, so it goes back to, like, let's look at the database function. Here, this insert one method, insert one returns data about the operation. And that data I put in a console table. And so there's an object here. And this object has an acknowledged property that's either true or false. So insert one returns an object with an acknowledged property is either true or false, and then we send that object back to here and basically say, hey, this object, db result, needs to test against that acknowledged property right here. Okay, so I tested it against the wrong property. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I hope I'm explaining that clearly.
So if you were testing it against the inserted ID, then you would verify there was a 1?
Yeah, but there was no inserted ID. It was...
No, like if there was, then that's what we just...
Yeah, if there was, that's what I thought there was going to be, but I was wrong. And I thought it was going to be because I thought GitHub Copilot was smart. And sometimes it is smart, but sometimes it.
I just didn't know how you got from, like, there to the acknowledgement.
Yeah, I looked at the council table and saw that's where the property was. So if I kind of go back to Postman and I add a new book here, I'll call it How to Code 2. Now it says How to Code 2 was added. And I would even give it like with an ID of, and I'm going to do, now the inserted ID isn't there. So let me think about how to get the ID.
You check the.
Because inserted ID here doesn't have any value. Think about this.
Could you check the corresponding ID that's with that title that you used? Just do like new with that ID.
It would be nice if the inserted ID did have a value there. But it doesn't. How to Code 3. How to Code 2. Well, there's my ID. But again, kind of going back to my inserted ID, it's not there. Just to, you know, so if I were to say council.law, let's do this. We could, just to be really sure, we could debug database and say result dot inserted ID. And let's just see, let's just make sure that there's no ID kind of going in. How to Code 4. And if I go back to my, oh, it is. I'm not sure why it wasn't showing up in my table, but inserted ID does have a value. Cool. So now we go back to book.js with an ID of DB result inserted ID. And so now, how to Code 5. Aha. We got an extra curly in there, but that works. I like that. Now that we have 5 how to code books, we'll be deleting some books. Next operation. So the only thing I added was DB result has an inserted ID and an acknowledge property, and we can use them both. Yep, good eye. We do want to call this add book inside of your try block. I just overlooked that, thank you.